Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about my best books of 2023 so far. We're at the midpoint of the year. I don't know how that happened, but it's the time of year on BookTube where we are taking stock of the past 6 months, looking out towards the future and hoping that we will read some fantastic books alongside those that we've already read. To be honest with you, I thought it was going to be quite hard to make this list because I've actually not had any 5-star books this year. Nothing that I think is like hit a new all-time favourite level. But actually when it came to compiling this list, I actually have 11 books to show you. Obviously it would have been a lot neater if I could have just chosen 10, but I found it really hard to choose one of these books that I didn't want to include. So I'm just going to show you all 11. Obviously by the time we get to the end of the year and I'm doing like my top 10 of the whole year, I'm probably going to be a bit more strict with myself. But for now, I'm just going to show you everything. First favourite book of the year so far has to be Once Upon a Tome by Oliver Darkshire. This is a really hysterically funny memoir with Oliver Darkshire talking about his time working at Sotheran's bookshop, which is one of the oldest antiquarian bookshops in London. I think he was a teenager or at least a young adult when he started working there. He had no real experience to speak of, so was quite surprised when he ended up getting a job there. And it's his process of learning more about this place and all of the many weird and wonderful customers that come through, all the different difficulties of working in an antiquarian bookshop. A lot of people think it's a very romanticised thing, and he's definitely showing that it is not. And the different ways that the bookshop has had to adapt over the years, particularly with changing technologies. But I think what really stands out about this, if you've ever checked out the Sotheran's Twitter account, which I believe is still run by Oliver, he's just got this really dry, deadpan sense of humour, which I enjoy very, very much. And that is seeped through this entire memoir. And I found myself laughing out loud at some points. I just think he is a fantastic narrator of his life. And it's one that I haven't heard very many people talking about, so I really recommend this. I think this is a bit of an underrated gem. Next up, we have Carrie, Soto is Back by Jenkins Reid, which I believe is her most recent offering in her little quartet of books that are about fame, that are kind of in the same universe. This is very much existing in the same world as The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, Daisy Jones and the Six, and Malibu Rising. And it's a funny one because obviously anything Jenkins Reid writes will get recognition and notice, but honestly out of those 4 books I feel like I've heard very little about this, and the little I did hear was kind of not negative, but it didn't seem to live up to other people's expectations. So I was really pleasantly surprised when I enjoyed this quite as much as I did. So in this you've got the main character of Carrie Soto, who is a world-renowned tennis player but has for many years been in retirement. She's known to be quite a cold, standoffish kind of character, very competitive, won't let anything stand in her way, and especially will not get like involved romantically or even platonically with anybody, particularly anybody who she sees as competition. Her father was her coach, but we know in the present timeline that they've had quite a strange relationship over the years. But when a new, younger champion seems to be encroaching on her record for the most titles won, this is enough to snap Carrie out of her retirement, to prove once and for all that she is the best female tennis player of all time. Carrie obviously is a character that not many people are meant to like, but I found her so interesting to read about. One of those people who I can imagine not really liking very much as a person. If I met her, I wouldn't want to go out for coffee with her. But because we're meeting her from being a child when she's first introduced to the game, we see how she hasn't always been as prickly as she's portrayed in her later years, and how a lot of it is very much the training, the attitudes that were instilled in her by her father. A lot of it is a defense mechanism, her reaction to sexism within the tennis world. She's a very compelling, if not always likable character, and I just don't think that every character that you read about has to be likable to be interesting. I love the discussion of tennis in here. I like how it's portrayed, and the actual games themselves, all of the nitty-gritty details don't bog down the plot. I'm very interested to see what one of my friends who is a tennis player thinks of this. And yeah, made me even want to watch Wimbledon this year, which I'm always saying that I'm going to do. I feel like out of all of the sports in the world, tennis is probably the thing that I could get most into. And I actually think by the time this video goes up, Wimbledon will be over. But while I'm filming, it's definitely just beginning. So we'll see. Do I end up watching Wimbledon? Who knows? Speaking of prickly characters, next up we have Lady Macbethad by Isabelle Schuler. This is historical fiction dramatising the life of the inspiration behind Lady Macbeth, because historically there was a king of Scotland called Macbeth, though the true life history of this king of Scots is very, very different to how Shakespeare depicted him. And so you'd probably imagine that the depiction of his wife was also very, very different to what really occurred. But the trouble with Lady Macbeth, or Gruach, is that we don't really have much in the way of records for her, which gives historical fiction writers a lot of leeway to play around with a backstory for her. And that's what Isabelle Schuler really provides in this book. Definitely a fictionalised account of her life. And this book is very much looking at the early life of Gruach, before she is even married to Macbeth, demonstrating the difficulties of being a woman in medieval society, but also leaving little breadcrumbs for the character that would become recognisable in Shakespeare's Macbeth. You see coldness, you see someone who has the ability to be calculating, cunning and ruthless, but she's still a child and teenager through most of this book, so that is definitely part of her personality personality that hasn't fully come out and developed yet. There are some really fun little allusions to Macbeth throughout the story, which are always great but not too heavy-handed. I mentioned this in my History-a-thon video, and I did get a comment saying that the history behind this was quite disappointing, that it wasn't very accurate, which is something that I kind of expected. And I'm not trying to present this as being a historically accurate historical fiction, but I think it's a really interesting thought experiment, using history, using Shakespeare, and kind of just spinning off from that. If you want something that is very true to real life, you're probably not going to get this here. But I really enjoyed it, and I was especially pleased with how much I enjoyed this, considering I read Learwife last year, which I didn't really like so much, so I was a bit skeptical of this, but I really found it compelling. Another book that I read for History-a-thon was our group pick, kind of our book club book for the month of March, which was Women vs. Hollywood by Helen O'Hara, and I'm so pleased at how much I enjoyed this. This basically gives a whistle-stop tour from the beginning of film to the present day, and recounting the lives of different women in the film industry and how women have generally been treated quite badly by Hollywood. Some of my favourite parts of this were actually the silent film era, which unexpectedly had a lot more freedoms for women and the ability to actually take charge and ownership. There were so many more female directors by percentage in the silent film era than there are even now, and that section was just really engaging and something I hadn't really thought about. But this is just as engaging and thought-provoking and quite sad at times all the way throughout. We're looking at the impact of the Hays Code on how women were treated, auteur theory, and how directors acting as auteurs can actually mean quite detrimental effects for the women in their casts and crews. There are some case studies in here, particularly Alfred Hitchcock and his treatment of women, and I really enjoyed the way that Helen O'Hara was able to really effortlessly glide in and out of these case studies and then reflect back on the wider film industry. There's this tone to her writing which is just kind of barely concealed rage, and she does admit right from the beginning that this book is kind of polemical. She does definitely back up her sources, but you can definitely tell there is a direction that she's taking this, which is that Hollywood definitely needs to change its practices, and that there are some ways in which Hollywood is even worse than it was 100 years ago. But it's not all doom and gloom, you are definitely seeing some hope, and she does actually offer solutions for better practices for Hollywood. This is a really brilliant read, and I would say, you know, I don't have a massive amount of knowledge about Hollywood and about film. You know, I am a very casual moviegoer, but I got a lot out of this, and I think other readers could too. Another history that I absolutely devoured was Uproar, Satire, Scandal and Printmakers in Georgian London by Alice Loxton. Link down below for my full review of this one, but this is a history of the printmakers of late Georgian London, particularly looking at James Gilray, Thomas Rowlandson, Isaac Cruikshank, and the effect and legacy of their prints in shaping Georgian society and culture. This is a history that I did know quite a bit about already. I'd studied it at university, and it's one that I'm so surprised hasn't already been covered in a popular history, so I'm really glad that this now does exist. What I love most about this is the way that Alice Loxton tells this history. I mentioned in my review of this that I feel like she's kind of trying to mimic the tone and the style of these caricatures by presenting this history in kind of a caricatured way. She will even come up with entire fictionalized scenes, dialogue between these different historical figures, and imagining what they might have said, and it's very much dramatized, it's very much a heightened reality, but it works so well when the topic at hand is these caricature prints depicting these historical figures that are very real, but in a way where the emotions are heightened in a way that is not quite true to real life, but very true to public perceptions of these figures, and something that people can see the truth in, even if it is a fictionalized scene. She's a very funny writer and so knowledgeable about this time period, and I really dearly hope that more people read this. A historical fiction book that I was delighted to finally get around to was The Secrets of Heartwood Hall by Katie Lumsden. I'd kind of been putting this off because, you know, when it's a booktube book, when it's a book written by somebody that you know, I don't know, I always feel a little bit of nervous anticipation, like what if I didn't like this? You know, I even went to the book launch for this book. I want good things, but I was terrified. But please be assured, no terror need go into your reading of this, because this is just as good as I hoped it would be, or even better than I could have expected. In this, you've got the widowed Margaret Lennox, who ends up taking a position as governess at Heartwood Hall, taking charge of the education of young Louis Aversham. But what she notices upon arriving in this village is that people are quite anxious about Heartwood Hall. People tend to stay away. There's a bit of mystery, a bit of intrigue, particularly around the figure of Mrs. Eversham, Louis's mother, who Margaret can't quite work out. And we know eventually that these secrets are going to unravel and have to get out. But Margaret also has secrets of her own, things from her past that she has tried to hide and get away from in this new life at Heartwood Hall. And as Margaret's secrets and the secrets of Heartwood Hall start to converge, is this going to spell disaster for all involved? See, look at that, I could have been a blurb writer. I Absolutely love this. One of my main criticisms that I often have of historical fiction, particularly historical fiction that is depicting the Victorian period, is that I feel like a lot of authors tend to prioritise atmosphere and historical detail over the characters, but I feel like Katie really fleshed out these characters, made them feel very, very real. She plays with a lot of Victorian literature tropes and makes it really fresh and modern, while at the same time this is very much a love letter to the Victorian classics that we all know that she loves. There are allusions in here to different Bronte books, some characters that even have a little bit of a Dickensian twist to them, while still feeling like real characters and not going quite down the caricatural level of Dickens's characters. I definitely need to talk about this more in a full video later, but I just thought this was brilliant and I'm so glad that I did finally get around to reading this. Next up, we couldn't be talking about my reading this year without talking about romance books, and I have two for you. One is a contemporary and one is a historical, and both from authors that I have loved the works from previously. So for my contemporary, we have Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood. I've actually read 3 Ali Hazelwood books so far this year. Love on the Brain, Love Theoretically, and then Loath to Love You, which is a bind-up of 3 different novellas. But I actually read Love on the Brain post doing Evita. I was in a production of Evita, and so for the month of January, which were the last few weeks before the show at the end of the month, I barely read anything, and I was so frazzled that when the first weekend of February came round, I had nowhere to be. I had an entirely blank weekend. I decided to treat myself to having that potato weekend that I'd been craving, and I just sat on the sofa reading books all weekend. This was one of those books, and it was just the perfect tonic after a very stressful January. True to Ali Wood's typical form, this is a romance in a STEM environment. The main character B, who is aiming to work for NASA, but is very put off from doing so when she finds out that she is going to be working on this project alongside Levi Ward, who had been her nemesis at grad school. They seem to be polar opposites, but the more they get to know each other, the more they start to think that maybe their perceptions of each other may have been false, and maybe they're actually perfect from each other and are gonna fall in love. I feel like if you've read The Love Hypothesis and you've made your mind up about Ali Hazelwood, your opinions of her there are going to very much filter through to this book. I feel like I've seen some people say that Ali Hazelwood's plots are basically copy-paste from the previous book. I definitely think they are different. You can definitely do an Ali Hazelwood bingo card for all of the different things that she throws into all of her books, but I don't go to romance books for unpredictability, to be honest. And I feel like that's the joy of falling in love with different romance authors, is that you understand the tropes that they tend to use, their different trademark styles and things that they go back to again and again. And that's what I got from this. It was a real comfort read and I really enjoyed it. Then for my historical romance, we have The Duchess Deal by Tessa Dare. You could probably have predicted that the next time I read a Tessa Dare book following When a Scot Ties the Knot, I was going to enjoy it just as much. I would probably say that When a Scot Ties the Knot does pip this to the post a little bit, but I just love Tessa Dare's romance writing, and I feel her strength is especially her concepts for these romance plots. So in this book, you've got the Duke of Ashbury, who's returned from the war and has returned with battle scars that has made his fiancée decide that she doesn't want to marry him anymore because she thinks he is so hideous. And this has made the Duke of Ashbury, who was already quite a snarky figure, turn positively cynical, as you'd expect. And he's decided to very much retreat into himself and not want to go out into society. But he knows that in order to make sure that his title gets passed down to future generations and stays within his family, he does have to marry and have an heir. He's pondering this when who should come stumbling into his office but a young woman wearing a wedding dress. She introduces herself as Emma Gladstone and says that she was the seamstress who was working on his former fiance's wedding dress, but she hasn't been paid for the work that she's done. And basically she's turned up to his house in the wedding dress to be like, look at what I made for you, please pay me. And he's like, she'll do. And so he proposes to her on the spot, knowing that in her reduced circumstances and in the face of all of the benefits that he can offer as a duke, she can't really say no. Emma does agree to the marriage, knowing full well that it's going to be beneficial to her, but declares that she is going to have agency within this marriage. All the power is not going to be with him. He is not going to talk down to her. He's going to let her be an equal partner as his wife, and they are going to have dinner together every night. He's quite reluctant to some of this because he has very much been a loner, especially in recent months, but he does agree to these terms and they do get married. But once again, with the forced proximity, learning more about each other, spending more time with each other, are they going to fall in love? Of course they are. As with all Tessa Dare books, this is just so enjoyable. I don't want to give too much away because I feel like this is one that you just have to dig into for yourself, but this has kind of given me a prod and a kick that I definitely need to go back and read more Tessa Dare, because I've enjoyed 2 out of 2 of her books so far. She just keeps knocking them out of the park. Next up we have A Terrible Kindness by Jo Browning Wroe. This was actually the first book that I finished in the year. Definitely set the tone for me. The main thing that you'll hear about this book is that it centres the Aberfan disaster and the main character William Lavery, who has trained as a mortician, having to go to Aberfan to recover all of the children's bodies and to prep them for burial. But actually that premise that you'll often hear people say is only a very small percentage of this book. William's experience at Aberfan kind of is the culmination of lots of different things that have happened throughout his life, and a lot of these aspects kind of converging together and reminding him of his past. But a much larger chunk of this book is actually taking place in William's childhood and his young life at Cambridge, training as a young boy chorister. It's about his relationship to his mother, who's really pushing him down this path of singing, and her strained relationship to William's uncle, the brother of his father. I felt like all of the characters in here were just so well realised and so complex. These characters feel very real because, you know, they are good people at heart, but often can do terrible things. No one more so than William himself, who in a lot of ways can be this really kind-hearted person who wants to take care of people, but when he is at his worst, he can be sullen, he can be snarky, he can be hurtful. And I feel like at the heart of this book is how easy it is to go down the path of either being terrible or being kind, how both can exist in the same person. It's especially about William's journey, coming to terms with his past, not letting the terrible things that happened in his past define his present and his future, and particularly towards the end of the book, him acknowledging that his life may have gone a different path to what his childhood had predisposed him to, but that doesn't mean that he failed at life, and it also doesn't mean that he has to reject his childhood and the things that he used to love in order to move forward. I feel like I have more coherent thoughts about this in the book review video that I did for this, but it is a fantastic story. I immediately wanted to go back to the beginning and read it again once I'd finished it, and I have been quite good so far, but I might be due a reread of this one. The only poetry collection on this list, I think this might be the only poetry collection I've read so far this year, was Wearing My Mother's Heart by Sophia Thakur. Sophia Thakur also had a place on my 2020 Best Books of the Year for her collection Somebody Give This Heart a Pen, and this follow-up, Wearing My Mother's Heart, is such a lovely follow-up. In Somebody Give This Heart a Pen, it's very internal, it's very much about Sophia Thakur's personal struggles, and in here she's kind of opening it out to other people and kind of trying to showcase the perspectives and the life experiences of the women around her, particularly her mother, her grandmother, and we're having this real generational look. It's a collection about family and love and compassion. It's about making your family proud, but also recognising the ways that previous generations may have failed us and how we are going to do better, but then also feeling like maybe you're not living up to your ancestors. There's so many different themes running through this that once again I feel like in my little 2-minute segment talking about it now I'm not doing it justice, but once again I will link down at the full book review video that I did for this. It's just absolutely stunning. And then the final favourite book of the year so far that I had to share with you was Elizabeth of York, The Last White Rose by Alison Weir. You will have seen last year that I thoroughly enjoyed my time reading Alison Weir's 6 Tudor Queens series, and so when I found out that she was starting the Tudor Rose series, going through the different generations, starting with Elizabeth of York, then following through to Henry VIII and then Mary I, I had to snap this up when it came into paperback. I find Elizabeth of York, who was wife of Henry VII, mother to Henry VIII, such a fascinating figure, but she's also one that we don't have a whole lot of documentary evidence for. She doesn't seem to have been the most proactive figure in the Wars of the Roses, particularly compared to somebody like Margaret of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville or Margaret Beaufort, but through her life she was witness to so many fascinating moments of history. And one of the biggest mysteries of all, what happened to her 2 brothers, the 2 princes in the Tower. I've compared this book a lot to her depiction of Jane Seymour, the 3rd book in the 6 Tudor Queen series, Jane Seymour, the Haunted Queen. And I think they are quite comparable because these are both quite quiet figures in the historical record. And so they are depicted as so quiet figures, but who have this very strong inner world that a fictional narrative is able to bring out a lot more. It's her really digging into the psychology of Elizabeth of York. Even if we don't see her personal actions imprinted on the historical record, that doesn't mean that she's not taking a lot of things in. It doesn't mean that these things aren't affecting her, and even playing around with ways that she might have been active but the historical record just wouldn't show it. As a fellow quiet girl myself, I feel like I can relate. Considering how chunky this is, coming in at around about 500 pages, I absolutely flew through it, and then a couple of months later I decided to give it another read because I just felt like I wasn't done with this story. I feel like I enjoy Alison Weir's fiction writing even more so than I do her non-fiction, because I feel like she's able to craft these personalities using the historical sources but also not being afraid to kind of riff on them when she needs to, but in a way that is not just drama for the sake of drama. She's definitely making intentional choices when she does diverge from written historical sources, and that's all I ever really want, is for historical fiction writers to use sources in clever ways. But yes, thoroughly enjoyed this. This is probably my favourite book that I've read so far this year. So there we go, those are all of my favourite books of the year so far. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I've spoken about today. Alternatively, please let me know of any books that you've really been enjoying this year. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.